The first time the bridge collapsed, it wasn't with a sound. It was with silence. No warning signs. No public notice. Just fresh dirt, broken timber, and a handwritten HOA notice taped to a post, claiming authority over land they never owned. By the time the truth surfaced, careers were over, reputations were destroyed, and a quiet neighborhood learned how fast power turns into panic when the wrong people cross the wrong line. If you believe in real justice, real consequences, and watching unchecked power collapse under its own lies, subscribe now. Because stories like this don't just expose HOA abuse, they show what happens when arrogance meets undeniable truth. The bridge had always been there, long before the neighborhood signs, before the uniform mailboxes, before the HOA ever learned how to print violation letters. It stretched low and narrow over a shallow creek, framed by cottonwood trees and rusted guardrails, the kind of structure no one noticed until it mattered. For decades, it served farmers, delivery trucks, school buses, and anyone who needed to cross from one side of the valley to the other without driving 15 extra miles. It was quiet infrastructure, invisible in the way essential things often are. When the new development arrived, everything changed. The subdivision was built fast and marketed aggressively, promising private roads, exclusive access, and a controlled environment. The Homeowners Association came with it, polished and confident, armed with bylaws thick enough to feel permanent. New residents were told they were buying into order, into safety, into authority. What they weren't told was how quickly that authority would start inventing boundaries. The bridge became a problem the moment it became useful to someone the HOA didn't like. It started small, as these things usually do. Complaints about outside traffic. Emails about noise. Casual remarks in HOA newsletters suggesting the bridge was community property and subject to association oversight. Most people ignored it. The bridge had always been public. Everyone knew that. Or at least, everyone assumed it was. Then the notices appeared. Bright paper stapled to wooden posts on either side of the bridge, stamped with the HOA logo and filled with legal-sounding language. Unauthorized use prohibited. Structural concerns cited. Closure pending review. The wording was vague, confident, and completely unsupported by any posted permit. Residents whispered but kept crossing. No one wanted to be the first to challenge it. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. The HOA board, emboldened by years of unchallenged fines and compliance letters, had decided the bridge was theirs to control. No survey confirmed it. No title search supported it. They relied instead on assumption and repetition, two tools that had served them well before. They convinced themselves that proximity equaled ownership, that management equaled authority, that silence equaled consent. The first real resistance came quietly, from a property owner on the far side of the creek who depended on the bridge daily. When access was threatened, questions were asked. Emails were sent. Requests for documentation went unanswered. The HOA responded with escalation instead of explanation, issuing warnings and citing safety hazards without evidence. The tone shifted from managerial to hostile. Then, one morning, heavy machinery arrived. No announcement. No county trucks. Just a rented excavator and a handful of workers directed by HOA representatives wearing reflective vests and self-assured expressions. They worked fast, tearing into the bridge decking, pulling up planks, dumping debris into waiting trailers. By noon, the crossing was impassable. By evening, it was destroyed. The justification came later, in a carefully worded statement claiming emergency action. They said the bridge was unsafe. They said it posed liability risks. They said they acted in the community's best interest. What they didn't say was who authorized the destruction, or under what legal right. The assumption was clear. No one would dare question them. But someone already had. A routine call to the county infrastructure office, made by a frustrated resident who'd lost access to their own land, triggered the first crack. The county employee on the other end paused longer than expected, then asked for clarification. Which bridge? Which parcel? Which authority? The answers didn't line up. County records showed the bridge as public infrastructure, maintained decades earlier under a rural access program. Easements were clearly marked. Maintenance responsibility, while deferred, still belonged to the county. The HOA had no jurisdiction, no claim, no authority. The discovery didn't spread immediately. It moved slowly, like water seeping through dirt, finding every weak spot. A county engineer visited the site. Photos were taken. Notes were made. The destruction was documented as unauthorized interference with public property. The HOA didn't know any of this yet. They continued operating as if nothing had happened, issuing statements, dismissing complaints, assuring residents that everything was handled. Internally, they congratulated themselves on decisive leadership. The bridge, they believed, had been a nuisance. Now it was gone. What they didn't realize was that by removing it, they hadn't erased a problem. They had created a case. Residents began to feel the impact almost immediately. Emergency response times increased. School routes were altered. Deliveries were delayed. The inconvenience turned into anger, and anger turned into questions. Why wasn't the county involved? Why hadn't anyone seen permits? Why did the story keep changing? Silence from the HOA only made it worse. When the county issued its first formal inquiry, requesting an explanation for the destruction of public infrastructure, the board was caught completely off guard. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Legal counsel was suddenly involved. The confidence that once defined their actions began to fracture. The bridge, even in pieces, was still doing its job. It was connecting people, this time through shared suspicion, shared inconvenience, and a growing realization that someone in power had crossed a line they didn't understand. And as the truth crept closer, it became clear this wasn't just about a bridge. It was about what happens when control replaces law, and when the wrong people learn too late that assumption is not ownership. The morning after the county inquiry arrived, the HOA office felt different. The building itself hadn't changed, but the air inside carried a tension that didn't belong there before. Phones rang longer before anyone answered. Emails were reread instead of replied to. Confidence, once worn like a uniform, had begun to fray. The letter from the county was brief, factual, and devastatingly calm. It didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It simply asked for documentation authorizing the removal of a structure listed in county records as public infrastructure. The absence of anger in the language made it worse. It implied certainty. The board convened an emergency meeting behind closed doors. No agenda was shared. No minutes were recorded. Those who entered the room carried binders full of rules and policies that suddenly felt thin. The bridge decision, once spoken of casually, was now dissected word by word. Who approved it? Who ordered it? Who signed off on the contractor? Each question landed heavier than the last. At first, denial dominated the room. They insisted the bridge fell within subdivision boundaries. They referenced outdated maps printed during early development. They repeated phrases they'd used for years, words like oversight and community authority. None of it changed the county's records. None of it answered the central question: what legal right had they acted under? The answer, unspoken but increasingly obvious, was none. Outside that room, the neighborhood buzzed with uncertainty. Residents compared notes at mailboxes and driveways. Stories shifted from confusion to concern. People began sharing screenshots of old property listings, archived county maps, and forum posts mentioning the bridge decades before the HOA existed. The narrative was slipping out of the board's control. The HOA responded the only way it knew how. They doubled down. A formal notice was sent to residents, asserting that the bridge had always been under HOA management and that its removal was a necessary safety measure. The tone was authoritative, the language confident. It was meant to quiet doubt. Instead, it ignited it. Because by then, the county trucks had arrived. They didn't bring sirens or spectacle. Just officials with clipboards, cameras, and neutral expressions. They photographed the damage. They measured distances. They compared GPS coordinates to official easements. Each step confirmed what the records already said. The bridge was not private. Word spread faster than the county could document it. Residents watched from porches and sidewalks, whispering as officials walked the site. Phones recorded from a distance. The quiet presence of authority contrasted sharply with the HOA's increasingly loud statements. Inside the boardroom, panic began to replace denial. Legal counsel advised caution. Insurance providers requested details. Contractors asked for clarification about unpaid invoices. The bridge, once a minor inconvenience, had become a liability with layers of consequence. The realization settled in slowly. This wasn't an internal matter anymore. Emails from residents grew sharper. Questions demanded answers instead of assurances. Some residents asked about access rights. Others asked about emergency services. A few asked the question the board feared most: who was going to pay for this? The HOA tried to regain control through process. They scheduled a town hall meeting, framing it as a transparency initiative. Notices were sent with carefully chosen language, emphasizing community unity and patience. The meeting room filled beyond capacity, residents standing along walls and spilling into hallways. The board sat at the front, elevated slightly, a physical reminder of hierarchy that no longer felt secure. They spoke first, reading prepared statements about safety, responsibility, and ongoing reviews. They avoided specifics. They avoided timelines. They avoided the word county. The crowd listened in silence, not out of respect, but calculation. Then the questions began. One by one, residents asked what authority had been used. Why no permits were posted. Why county officials were seen inspecting the site. The board's answers circled without landing, each response revealing less clarity than the last. Murmurs grew louder. Phones recorded openly now. When someone mentioned public records confirming county ownership, the room shifted. The board attempted to dismiss it as misinformation. But doubt had already taken root. The certainty that once defined HOA power was cracking under the weight of visible evidence. People who had once paid fines without question were now questioning everything. After the meeting, silence fell again, heavier than before. The county's follow-up letter arrived days later, this one less gentle. It referenced statutes. It outlined potential penalties. It requested immediate cooperation. The bridge's destruction was now officially categorized as unauthorized interference with public infrastructure. Insurance companies began distancing themselves. Coverage was questioned. Claims were flagged. The financial implications grew darker with each passing hour. The HOA's reserves, once a source of pride, suddenly looked insufficient. Residents felt the shift. Trust eroded quickly when power faltered. Conversations turned from inconvenience to accountability. People wanted names. They wanted explanations. Some wanted restitution. Others wanted resignation. The bridge, though still broken, had become a mirror. It reflected years of unchecked authority, decisions made without oversight, and a culture that mistook compliance for consent. The HOA's strength had always depended on the assumption that no one would challenge it. Now that assumption was gone. As legal deadlines approached and county officials prepared their next steps, the board faced a reality they had never planned for. Control, once exercised freely, now came with consequences. And the quiet panic setting in wasn't just about fines or repairs. It was about exposure. Because once authority is questioned publicly, it doesn't recover quietly. It unravels, document by document, decision by decision, until the story everyone believed no longer holds. And the county wasn't finished asking questions. The county didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. Its authority lived in records, not rhetoric, and those records were beginning to circulate. What had once been confined to offices and filing systems found its way into public view, carried by residents who had learned where to look and how to ask. Property maps appeared first. Old ones, scanned and shared, showing the bridge clearly marked as a public easement long before the subdivision was imagined. Maintenance logs followed, faded entries from decades ago confirming county work crews had reinforced the structure after floods, long before any HOA board existed. Each document chipped away at the version of reality the association had tried to enforce. The HOA responded with paperwork of its own. They produced bylaws, amendments, internal memos, and meeting notes, all intended to demonstrate governance. But none of it addressed ownership. None of it showed jurisdiction. It was paper power without foundation, rules stacked on top of assumptions. Against county records, it looked fragile. Residents noticed. The shift in tone was unmistakable. People who had once lowered their voices when mentioning the HOA now spoke openly. Sidewalk conversations grew longer, more deliberate. There was no shouting, no protest signs, just a steady exchange of information. Knowledge moved quietly, but it moved fast. The bridge became the center of every conversation. Emergency responders confirmed longer routes. Delivery companies documented delays. A farmer on the far side of the creek submitted a formal complaint detailing financial losses. Each impact added weight to the situation, transforming a structural issue into a community one. The county escalated. A formal notice of violation was issued, citing unauthorized demolition of public infrastructure. It wasn't a fine yet. It was worse. It was a declaration that the HOA's actions were officially outside the law. The board was given a deadline to respond, to cooperate, to provide names and contracts. Inside the HOA office, stress reshaped behavior. Meetings grew shorter but more frequent. Legal counsel spoke more than the board did. Words like exposure and liability replaced policy and compliance. Emails were drafted and redrafted, stripped of confidence and filled with qualifiers. The board members began to look tired. One resignation came quietly. A board member who had voted in favor of the bridge's removal stepped down, citing personal reasons. No statement was issued. No explanation offered. The departure spoke for itself. It signaled fracture, and fractures spread. The remaining board members closed ranks, but it only amplified suspicion. Transparency, once promised, now felt selective. Residents requested access to meeting minutes and financial records. Some requests were delayed. Others were denied. Each refusal became another data point. The county requested contractor details. The excavator company, when contacted, provided invoices and work orders without hesitation. They had been hired, paid, and directed by the HOA. No permits had been shown to them. No county approval mentioned. Their cooperation removed any remaining ambiguity about responsibility. The narrative was no longer in question. Local media took notice. A short article appeared online, factual and restrained, outlining the situation. It didn't sensationalize. It didn't assign blame beyond what was documented. But seeing it in print changed everything. The bridge was no longer a neighborhood issue. It was a public one. Comments followed. Some defended the HOA out of habit. Others criticized it openly. Most expressed disbelief that an association would destroy public property without verification. The story spread through shares and reposts, carried by the quiet momentum of accountability. The HOA issued a statement. It acknowledged a misunderstanding regarding ownership. It emphasized intentions rather than actions. It avoided apology. The phrasing felt rehearsed, legal, distant. It satisfied no one. The county's response was swift. Intentions, they clarified, did not override statute. Public infrastructure could not be altered without authorization, regardless of motive. Restoration options were outlined. Financial responsibility was made clear. Deadlines were reaffirmed. Residents felt a shift from confusion to certainty. They began asking different questions now. Not whether the HOA was wrong, but what would happen next. Would dues increase? Would insurance cover damages? Would the board be replaced? The bridge had become a catalyst for scrutiny far beyond itself. Trust, once lost, did not return. People revisited past fines, past warnings, past disputes. Patterns emerged. The bridge was no longer an isolated incident, but the most visible example of a broader issue, authority exercised without restraint. The realization was sobering. The HOA's internal communications reflected fear. Messages urged unity. Loyalty was emphasized. External criticism was framed as attack. The board spoke of protecting the community, but fewer people believed it. Protection, Residents now understood, required accountability. As the county prepared its final determination, the bridge site remained untouched. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Broken beams lay where they fell. It was a physical reminder of a decision that could not be undone quietly. Every passerby saw it. Every delay reinforced the cost of arrogance. The board faced a narrowing path. Cooperate fully and accept consequences, or resist and escalate a losing fight. Neither option preserved their authority. Both required admission of error. The power they once wielded so easily had turned heavy, difficult to lift. The bridge had not just connected two sides of a creek. It had connected records to reality, exposing the difference between rules written for control and laws written for everyone. And as the county's timeline moved forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about rebuilding a bridge anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had mistaken silence for approval and paperwork for power. The invoice arrived before the judgment did, and that was when the situation stopped feeling theoretical. Numbers have a way of cutting through denial faster than words ever can. The document was clean, precise, and unemotional, itemizing assessment costs, engineering reviews, environmental impact checks, and preliminary reconstruction estimates. The total sat far above what anyone on the board had expected, far above what they had ever budgeted for a problem they still struggled to admit was theirs. For the first time, the bridge wasn't just a symbol. It was a financial threat. The HOA's reserves, once presented proudly at annual meetings, were suddenly under a microscope. Residents demanded transparency, and this time the requests came with formal language and legal backing. State statutes guaranteed access to financial records, and several homeowners now knew exactly how to invoke them. The board could stall, but it could not refuse forever. As spreadsheets circulated, reality settled in. The association did not have enough money. Rebuilding the bridge to county standards would cost more than routine maintenance had for years combined. Insurance coverage was uncertain at best. The provider classified the demolition as intentional, unauthorized action, triggering exclusions buried deep in policy language. Legal counsel confirmed what the board feared most. Even if insurance contributed, it would not cover everything. Someone would pay the difference. That understanding spread through the neighborhood like a slow chill. Conversations shifted from outrage to fear. People who had never missed a dues payment now questioned whether they could absorb a special assessment of that size. Fixed incomes. Young families. Retirees who had bought into the promise of stability. The bridge's destruction reached into every household. The board called another meeting. This one was closed to the public. Behind the doors, voices rose. Accusations surfaced. Fingers pointed at the former member who had resigned, at the president who had pushed hardest for removal, at the property manager who had failed to verify ownership. Each person searched for distance from the decision, but the minutes told a different story. Votes were recorded. Approvals were unanimous. Responsibility was shared, whether they liked it or not. The county followed with its official determination. The demolition was ruled unlawful. Restoration was required. Penalties were assessed, reduced slightly in recognition of cooperation but substantial enough to sting. Deadlines were firm. Delays would incur additional fines. The language was final. The HOA was ordered to rebuild what it had destroyed. Public notice followed. The county published the ruling online, along with supporting documentation. Local media updated their coverage. The story evolved from confusion to consequence. Comments grew sharper. Sympathy faded. What remained was a lesson playing out in real time. Residents reacted differently. Some were furious, demanding immediate resignations. Others were exhausted, focused only on minimizing damage. A few defended the board out of loyalty or fear of instability. But the majority reached the same conclusion quietly: this never should have happened. Trust, once fractured, now collapsed. Homeowners organized independently. Committees formed without board involvement. Legal advice was shared. Recall procedures were researched. The HOA's authority, once unquestioned, now faced open challenge from the very people it claimed to represent. The board attempted damage control. They issued apologies carefully worded by attorneys, acknowledging error without assigning blame. They promised reforms, oversight, and transparency. They emphasized unity. The timing undercut the message. Apologies delivered after consequences rarely feel sincere. Special assessment notices were drafted. They were not sent immediately, but everyone knew they were coming. The amount was debated, recalculated, softened where possible, but there was no escaping it. The bridge had to be rebuilt. The money had to come from somewhere. The neighborhood changed tone. Yards once trimmed to perfection showed signs of neglect. For sale signs appeared. Conversations avoided eye contact. The HOA, once a source of order, now felt like a burden. Its rules, its letters, its presence all carried a new weight. The bridge site remained a scar. County engineers marked measurements with spray paint. Stakes were driven into the ground. The reconstruction plan took shape, larger and stronger than before. It would meet modern standards. It would last decades. It would also stand as a permanent reminder of the cost of overreach. The board members felt it personally. Some stopped attending social events. Others avoided walking their dogs during busy hours. The respect they once commanded had evaporated. They were no longer seen as volunteers serving the community, but as decision-makers whose mistakes carried consequences for everyone. One board member broke down during a private meeting. Not from anger, but from realization. Years of enforcing rules, issuing fines, and asserting authority had been justified internally as service. The bridge stripped that narrative bare. Service without accountability, it turned out, was just control. As reconstruction contracts were finalized, another reality emerged. The county would oversee the rebuild. The HOA would not manage the project. It would not select materials. It would not dictate timelines. Its role was reduced to funding and compliance. Authority, once assumed, was now explicitly denied. That loss stung more than the fines. The bridge would rise again, but not under HOA control. It would stand as public infrastructure, clearly marked, undeniably outside association reach. The boundary the HOA had tried to erase would now be reinforced in steel and concrete. Residents watched the process with mixed emotions. Relief that access would return. Anger at the cost. A quiet satisfaction that limits had been enforced. The system, slow as it was, had worked. The board faced its future. Recalls loomed. Elections approached. The narrative was no longer theirs to shape. The bridge had crossed them into territory where authority required proof, and proof demanded humility. What began as an attempt to control a crossing had become a lesson in restraint. And as construction crews prepared to pour new foundations, one truth settled across the neighborhood with the weight of finality. Power, once abused, does not rebuild easily. The days after the assessment notices went out were quieter than anyone expected. There were no protests, no shouting matches in the streets, no dramatic confrontations in the HOA office. Instead, the neighborhood retreated inward, each household doing its own math, measuring its own tolerance for loss. Silence replaced outrage, and that silence carried weight. People began to see each other differently. Neighbors who once chatted easily now exchanged cautious nods. Conversations that did happen stayed shallow, orbiting weather and routine rather than risk. Everyone knew the same truth, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. The bridge had cost them more than money. It had cost them certainty. The special assessment figures varied by lot size and tenure, but the numbers were undeniable. For some, it meant delaying vacations or dipping into savings. For others, it meant choosing between stability and sacrifice. The HOA had always spoken in terms of collective responsibility, but now that phrase felt hollow. Responsibility, it turned out, was not equally felt. The resentment didn't explode. It settled. Residents replayed the timeline in their minds, tracing moments where someone should have asked a question, where someone should have stopped the process. They remembered the newsletters that praised decisiveness, the meetings where dissent felt unwelcome, the small penalties that trained compliance. The bridge was not an isolated mistake. It was the end result of years of conditioned silence. People began to talk privately. Small groups met in living rooms and kitchens, sharing documents and timelines. They compared old emails, minutes, and notices. Patterns emerged. Decisions made quickly. Objections dismissed politely and then ignored. Authority exercised with confidence but without verification. The bridge was simply the first time the consequences were too large to hide. The HOA board felt the shift immediately. Emails went unanswered longer than before. Volunteers stepped down from committees. Attendance at events dropped. The association still existed, still sent notices, still enforced rules, but its influence had thinned. People complied out of necessity, not respect. The county's reconstruction plan advanced steadily. Surveyors returned. Environmental checks were completed. Timelines were posted publicly. The transparency was deliberate, a contrast to what had come before. Residents noticed the difference. Information shared openly created calm. The absence of spin built trust. The county did not promise perfection. It promised clarity. That clarity exposed more than just the bridge. Residents began questioning other assumptions. Were certain roads truly private? Were fines always justified? Were rules applied consistently? The bridge had opened a door, and curiosity followed. The HOA tried to adapt. They announced policy reviews and invited feedback. They promised new procedures, external audits, and training. The gestures came late. Trust, once broken, does not mend through announcements. It requires time, accountability, and change that can be measured. Some residents chose distance instead. For sale signs multiplied quietly. Listings avoided mention of the HOA when possible. Real estate agents fielded careful questions. Buyers asked about assessments, governance, and recent history. The bridge followed every conversation, even when unspoken. For those who stayed, a new mindset took hold. People read notices more carefully. They attended meetings with notebooks instead of assumptions. They asked for documentation. The culture of compliance gave way to a culture of verification. It wasn't hostile. It was cautious. The board struggled with this new reality. Every decision required explanation. Every statement was scrutinized. Authority that once flowed freely now encountered friction. Meetings ran longer. Votes were closer. Silence was no longer mistaken for agreement. One evening, a resident formally requested a recall election. The request followed proper procedure. It cited bylaws. It included signatures. It did not accuse. It simply stated that confidence in leadership had eroded and that the community deserved a choice. The document circulated calmly, but its impact was seismic. The board acknowledged receipt. They did not contest its validity. They could have, but doing so would have reinforced the very concerns driving the request. Instead, they scheduled the vote. The act itself felt like an admission. As the date approached, the neighborhood grew reflective. People weighed stability against accountability. Some worried that change would bring chaos. Others believed chaos had already arrived and that pretending otherwise would only deepen it. The bridge stood unfinished, its absence a daily reminder of what unchecked decisions could cost. The county began reconstruction. Foundations were poured. Steel supports rose. The new bridge took shape methodically, built to last, designed for transparency. Signage clearly marked public ownership. Easements were reinforced. There would be no confusion this time. Residents watched the progress. Each beam felt like closure inching closer. The structure was larger, stronger, unmistakably official. It did not belong to the HOA. It belonged to everyone. That distinction mattered now more than ever. The recall vote took place in a packed room. Ballots were counted carefully. No speeches were made. No accusations voiced. The outcome was decisive. Leadership would change. The board, once so confident, was replaced by members promising restraint and verification. There was no celebration. Just a quiet release of tension, like a breath held too long finally exhaled. The community did not feel victorious. It felt wiser. The bridge would reopen soon. Access would return. Life would normalize. But the neighborhood that emerged would not be the same as the one that existed before. The illusion of absolute authority had been dismantled. In its place stood something less convenient but far more durable. Awareness. The cost of crossing the line had been paid, not just in dollars, but in trust, reputation, and time. The lesson lingered in every meeting, every notice, every decision made thereafter. Power, the community had learned, is safest when questioned early. And bridges, once destroyed, are never just rebuilt. They are remembered. The reopening didn't come with a ribbon or speeches. No cameras. No applause. Just the quiet removal of barriers and the sound of tires rolling across fresh pavement for the first time. That simplicity felt intentional, almost respectful, as if everyone involved understood this wasn't a victory to celebrate, but a wrong finally corrected. By sunrise, the bridge stood complete. Steel supports gleamed beneath it, clean and unmistakably modern. The deck was wider now, reinforced to county standards, bordered by guardrails that carried official markings impossible to ignore. At both ends, metal signs stated clearly and permanently that the structure was public infrastructure, maintained and governed by the county. There would be no confusion this time. Residents approached slowly. Some walked at first, testing the surface underfoot, listening to the hollow certainty of solid construction. Others drove across cautiously, as if expecting resistance where none existed. Each crossing felt symbolic, a return to normal that had been delayed far too long. The bridge carried more than traffic. It carried the memory of everything that had happened in its absence. The fines, the meetings, the documents, the anger that had cooled into resolve. Even restored, the bridge felt different. It was no longer invisible. It had become a reference point, a reminder of limits and consequences. The county's role was unmistakable. Maintenance schedules were posted publicly. Contact information was listed clearly. Transparency replaced assumption. Where the HOA once spoke vaguely of authority, the county spoke plainly of responsibility. The contrast did not go unnoticed. The new HOA board observed from a distance. They did not attempt to take credit. They did not issue statements celebrating resolution. Their restraint marked a shift in culture, one shaped by the understanding that overreach had nearly dismantled the community they were meant to serve. Residents noticed that too. Meetings changed tone. Agendas included verification steps. Motions referenced statutes instead of precedent. Questions were welcomed instead of deflected. Authority, now cautious, moved slower, but it moved correctly. The bridge's reopening triggered reflection. People thought about how easily the original destruction had happened. How confidence had replaced confirmation. How quickly a small group's assumptions had impacted an entire neighborhood. The bridge was rebuilt, but the memory of losing it lingered like a scar beneath fresh skin. Life resumed its rhythms. Emergency vehicles shortened their routes again. Deliveries arrived on time. Farmers crossed with equipment without detours. What had once been routine returned, but it carried new appreciation. Convenience, residents realized, was fragile when power went unchecked. The county closed its case publicly. Final reports were published. Penalties were paid. Compliance confirmed. The language was firm but neutral, as if the system itself was saying what it always had. Rules exist not to restrict communities, but to protect them from mistakes made in confidence. The media coverage faded. Without ongoing conflict, interest waned. The story slipped from headlines into archives. But inside the neighborhood, it did not disappear. It settled into collective memory, referenced quietly when new proposals arose or when authority felt too certain again. The former board members retreated from public life. Some moved away. Others stayed but kept distance from HOA matters. Their names were not spoken often, but their decisions were remembered. They became part of the community's cautionary history, an example invoked without malice but with clarity. The bridge stood as evidence, not of wrongdoing alone, but of correction. It proved that systems could respond, that authority could be challenged, that mistakes could be addressed openly. It also proved that damage done in haste carries costs that linger long after repairs are complete. Children crossed it on bikes. They had not known the bridge before its absence, only the stories. To them, it was simply a path, sturdy and reliable. Adults watched them cross with a mix of relief and reflection, aware that the lesson the bridge carried would matter most to those old enough to remember. The HOA's role evolved. It returned to what it should have been from the start: maintenance, coordination, communication. No more imagined jurisdiction. No more assumed ownership. The bridge incident had narrowed its focus, grounding it in reality rather than reach. Residents felt a subtle shift in power. Not seized, not redistributed, but clarified. Authority was no longer something to fear or obey blindly. It was something to understand, verify, and participate in. The bridge had taught that lesson without speeches or slogans. Months later, during a routine meeting, someone mentioned a new proposal involving common land. The room paused. Documentation was requested immediately. Jurisdiction clarified. County records consulted. The process took longer, but no one complained. The bridge had taught patience. Outside, the structure held firm. Rain came and went. Water passed beneath without issue. Trucks crossed daily. It did exactly what it was meant to do, quietly and reliably, without drawing attention. In that normalcy was its greatest impact. The community moved forward. Not healed entirely, but wiser. Not unified by pride, but by understanding. The bridge's destruction had revealed the danger of unchecked authority. Its restoration had shown the value of limits. And in the end, that was the real reconstruction. Not steel or concrete, but trust rebuilt carefully, reinforced by memory, and anchored by the knowledge that power, when questioned early, does not need to be torn down to be corrected. The bridge stood open. And this time, everyone knew exactly who owned it, and why that mattered. Time moved on the way it always does after a public reckoning, forward, steadily, without ceremony. The bridge reopened, traffic normalized, and the daily inconveniences faded into background noise. On the surface, the neighborhood looked unchanged. Lawns were trimmed again. Lights glowed warmly at dusk. Mailboxes filled and emptied on schedule. But beneath that calm, something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be restored as easily as concrete and steel. Authority had lost its illusion. The HOA still existed. Notices still went out. Meetings were still held. But the power behind those actions no longer carried automatic weight. Every directive now passed through a filter of scrutiny that had not existed before. Residents read closely. They asked questions. They requested sources. Compliance was no longer reflexive, it was conditional. This change did not arrive dramatically. It settled in slowly, through habits. People stopped assuming the board was right simply because it spoke with confidence. They verified claims. They checked records. The bridge incident had taught them how easily certainty could be manufactured and how costly that certainty could become when it went unchallenged. The new board understood this better than anyone. They had inherited not just a position, but a warning. Every action they took carried the shadow of what had come before. They spoke carefully, avoided sweeping language, and documented everything. Authority, to them, was no longer something to assert. It was something to earn repeatedly. Some residents appreciated the change. Others resented it. They missed the simplicity of obedience, the comfort of believing someone else had everything under control. Oversight required effort. Participation required time. But even those who complained quietly understood the alternative now. They had lived it. The bridge continued to influence decisions in unexpected ways. Proposals that once would have passed without discussion were now delayed pending verification. Jurisdictional questions were raised immediately. External agencies were consulted early. What once felt like unnecessary caution now felt like common sense. The HOA's tone softened. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Enforcement actions were fewer, better justified, and more transparent. Appeals were handled with patience rather than defensiveness. The organization was learning restraint, not as a virtue, but as a survival skill. Former board members watched this evolution from the sidelines. Some felt vindicated by the return to normalcy, believing the bridge incident had been an unfortunate anomaly. Others felt the weight of hindsight more heavily. They saw how easily things had escalated, how confidence had replaced diligence, how silence had been misread as support. Their authority had not been stripped overnight. It had dissolved slowly, under the pressure of consequence. The community remembered. Not loudly, not with blame, but with awareness. New residents were told the story quietly, framed as history rather than scandal. The lesson mattered more than the details. Power must be verified. Ownership must be proven. Authority must have limits. The bridge itself became part of orientation. When questions arose about boundaries or access, someone would reference it casually. The bridge was public. The bridge taught us that. It was said without bitterness, just fact. The structure had become shorthand for accountability. Trust rebuilt unevenly. Some residents never fully forgave the HOA, even under new leadership. Others moved on, content that systems had corrected themselves. Trust, unlike infrastructure, does not come with blueprints. It forms through consistency over time. The HOA accepted this reality. They stopped trying to reclaim admiration. They focused instead on function. Roads were maintained. Landscaping was handled. Communication improved. The work became quieter, less visible, and paradoxically more effective. The county remained present. Not intrusively, but clearly. Their signage stayed. Their maintenance schedule was followed. Their authority was never ambiguous. The contrast between public governance and private control remained visible, and that visibility reassured residents. The bridge did what bridges are meant to do. It carried weight without complaint. It endured weather and traffic. It existed without asserting itself. In that way, it embodied the lesson the neighborhood had learned the hard way. True authority does not need to announce itself. It proves itself through reliability. Years would pass, and details would blur. People would forget names, dates, and exact figures. But the feeling would remain. The memory of uncertainty. The moment when confidence cracked. The realization that no organization, no matter how familiar, should operate beyond verification. Children who crossed the bridge daily would grow up unaware of its history. Adults would watch them with quiet understanding. The lesson had been paid for already. It did not need to be repeated. The HOA's power settled into its proper place. Not dominant, not feared. Simply present, defined, and limited. The community had learned where the edges were, and those edges mattered. The bridge stood as the last word. Not in condemnation, but in clarity. It marked the boundary between assumption and fact, between control and governance. It reminded everyone that authority, once misused, does not return unchanged. It returns smaller, more careful, more accountable. And that was the cost the HOA would carry long after the fines were paid and the steel had set. Not punishment, but perspective. A permanent adjustment to how power was seen, measured, and allowed. The bridge had been destroyed once by certainty. It survived because certainty was replaced with proof. And that lesson, unlike concrete, would not erode with time. Long after the last county truck left and the bridge settled into its place as if it had always been there, the neighborhood learned that endings are rarely clean. There was no single moment when everything felt resolved. No announcement that declared closure. Instead, the story ended the way most real ones do. Quietly, through changed behavior, altered expectations, and a collective understanding that something irreversible had occurred. The bridge became ordinary again. Cars crossed it without slowing. Tires hummed over its surface. Rainwater flowed beneath it without pooling or drama. From a distance, it looked like infrastructure does when it works properly, unnoticed. Yet for those who lived nearby, it was impossible to forget what it represented. The bridge was no longer just a crossing. It was a boundary made visible. The HOA continued its work under new leadership, but the shape of that work had changed permanently. Decisions moved slower. Emails were longer. References were cited. When uncertainty appeared, it was acknowledged instead of hidden. Authority no longer rushed ahead of confirmation. The organization functioned, but it no longer dominated. Residents adjusted in their own ways. Some became more involved, attending meetings they once ignored. Others stepped back, content knowing that scrutiny existed even if they weren't providing it personally. Participation became a choice instead of a defense mechanism. The community did not become perfect, but it became aware. That awareness had weight. It changed how people interpreted power in small, everyday ways. A notice on a door was no longer accepted without reading. A rule was no longer enforced without explanation. Questions, once seen as disruption, were now treated as part of the process. The bridge incident had rewritten expectations without rewriting the bylaws. The former board members faded into memory. Their presence lingered only in documents and quiet references. They were not demonized. They were contextualized. Their mistake became a lesson rather than a scar. Time softened judgment but did not erase consequence. Authority lost through overreach did not return with time. It stayed lost, replaced by restraint. The county never wavered. Their signs remained clear. Their records stayed accessible. Their maintenance followed schedule. They did not gloat or retreat. They simply did their job, and that consistency reinforced the lesson more effectively than any reprimand ever could. Public authority, when exercised properly, did not need to compete for control. The bridge held firm through seasons. Heat expanded its steel. Cold contracted it. Water tested its foundations. It endured without attention, doing what it was meant to do. Each test it passed reinforced confidence not just in the structure, but in the process that rebuilt it correctly. New residents arrived. They asked about assessments and rules. Someone always mentioned the bridge, briefly and without drama. It was presented as history, not warning. Yet the meaning landed all the same. The community had learned where its power ended, and that knowledge protected it. The HOA's identity evolved. It became quieter, more administrative, less symbolic. That shift disappointed some who once enjoyed the sense of command. But most welcomed it. Stability replaced spectacle. Function replaced assertion. The association returned to its role as a tool rather than a force. The bridge incident stopped being referenced directly. Not because it was forgotten, but because its lesson had been absorbed. People didn't need to repeat it anymore. It showed up in how proposals were handled, how disputes were resolved, how authority was questioned respectfully instead of resisted explosively. The neighborhood regained something it hadn't realized it lost. Trust, not blind trust, but informed trust. The kind that rests on transparency rather than assumption. The kind that survives disagreement because it is anchored in process instead of personality. There were still conflicts. There always are. But they unfolded differently now. Slower. More carefully. With records checked before voices raised. The bridge had taught patience the hard way, and patience proved cheaper than consequence. Standing at the edge of the bridge one evening, it was easy to see why it had been taken for granted for so long. It did not announce itself. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, connecting two sides without claiming ownership over either. That was the irony. The HOA had destroyed the bridge believing control required possession. The community rebuilt itself by learning the opposite. Control without ownership was illusion. Authority without verification was risk. The bridge remained open to everyone. No gate. No sign restricting access beyond what the law required. Its presence no longer stirred resentment or pride. It was just there, solid and unremarkable, carrying the quiet power of something built correctly after being destroyed incorrectly. In the end, there was no dramatic justice. No arrests. No courtroom spectacle. No single villain. Just accountability, paid for in time, money, and humility. The HOA survived, but it did not emerge unchanged. It emerged smaller, bounded, and understood. That was the real outcome. The bridge taught the neighborhood where lines were drawn and why they mattered. It showed that authority could not be claimed into existence. It had to be proven, earned, and limited. Once crossed, that line could never be crossed again. And that knowledge, settled deeply into the community, ensured the bridge would never be destroyed a second time, not by machines, and not by assumption.